Hopefully you have come to this session on rubrics with an idea in mind about an assignment that you use in your class for which you would like to develop a rubric, because at least some of this time I hope to have you drafting some language that you might put on a rubric that you would actually use, because otherwise this next 50 minutes would be a waste of your time. So I have some slides I want to talk through, partly just so that we're using the same language. I want to note in the little bio, if you've read it, it says I'm an expert. I am not an expert. I think I've come at the expert process for developing a rubric. And that's what I'm going to share with you. There's no such thing as a perfect rubric. I am certainly not a perfect rubric constructor. This is where we're going to try to go in the next 50 minutes. If you can't hear me, would you wave? If you can hear me, would you wave? That works better, doesn't it? I want to give a little background. Why do we need a rubric? Every assignment does not need a rubric. Which kinds of assignments do? There are at least two types of rubrics, analytic and holistic, that I will show you. We're going to walk through some steps to create a rubric, and that's where you will do some work. Hopefully there'll be some time for a little bit of peer review of the language that you've created to put on your rubric, because when other people read what we write, it may mean something different to them than it did to us, and so there needs to be ample review. Talk about what we meant. Some possible pitfalls, inter-rater reliability, and then continuous improvement is improving our rubrics over time. The first time I create a rubric, I use it, I evaluate student work, I find out what was wrong with the rubric. Then it's time to immediately correct the rubric for use next term if I'm using that assignment again. But this slide is the best part of the whole presentation. Perhaps you have had this happen. And rather than plagiarize the entire Charles Schultz comic strip, Sally says, "May I ask a question? How can anyone get a C on a coat hanger sculpture? Was I judged on what I had learned in this project? If so, weren't you, my teacher, also being judged on your ability to transmit your knowledge to me? Are you willing to share my C? Was I judged on a piece of sculpture itself? If so, isn't it true that time alone can judge a work of art? If I was judged on my effort, then I was judged unfairly, for I tried as hard as I could. Or was I judged on my talent? If so, is it right that I be judged on a part of life over which I have no control?" So Sally's really asking for a rubric. She wants to know on what basis was her project graded. And that's what a rubric is. Excuse me, I'm having voice trouble. It's an anchor for evaluating student work. It's a way of describing to students what it is we're looking for if you share the rubric with students. There are situations in which you may not share the rubric with students. For example, I use a rubric to grade the essay portion of a final exam. And if I shared the rubric with students, it would give away the answer. So I post that rubric after the exam is done. But when your rubric is one that you can share with students without giving away the answer, then it's helpful to give students a clearer picture of what it is you're looking for. It helps you with a written description of what different levels of work look like. It also, I find for me, the process of creating the rubric by which I'm going to grade a student project helps me clarify in my own mind what it is I'm looking for. As does grading their work every term. Is this what I was looking for? No. How did I communicate that? It can enhance feedback because I can give back the rubric and just mark the relevant portions instead of writing the same comments to students over and over many times. And also, as a human being, my grading is possibly biased. And so using a rubric protects against bias, gives me an opportunity to explain to Sally how I graded her coat hanger sculpture. I'd like you to practice a little bit. I'm going to give you this assignment. Have a good day. Now, turn to a peer and talk about what a good day would be like. How do you know if you've had a good day or not? Talk to someone next to you for a couple minutes.
Have you had a good day? What is a good day?
Today has been a good day, yes.
Today has been a good day.
How about
what
you?
would a bad day be?
A bad day. Having a flat tire would be a bad day.
It sounds like it's happened recently.
Yes.
Okay, flat tire is a bad day. So a good day is no flat tire. Okay. That's very particular, very specific. I like it.
How about you?
A good day is getting up in the morning and having something like this to go to and not having to do all the work for it. And just sit back and take it all in and learn. It's a good day. It's a good day outside. The weather's a good day.
It is a good day outside.
A good day is waking up and not being in a hospital.
That's true. That's a good day.
I've had a good day. I've helped somebody with something. That's a good day. Hello, Lois. She's late. That's not a good day.
I'm going to cut you off. Just so we have more time to work on our actual assignment. But just to have a few of you share, what is a good day? What's a good day?
Well, we struggle with the whole idea of binary because it seemed to force us into this good bad, and we needed more gradation
Okay.
beyond good.
Yes.
So that was kind of where our conversation.
Okay. So there may be a good day, a bad day, and something in the middle.
An exceptional day.
Okay.
Mediocre day.
Ah, you're talking about levels of performance. We'll get there. What goes into a good day for some of the rest of you? Or a bad day? Or medium day?
Some productivity.
Some productivity.
Achieving the goal that we set out.
Okay. What a bunch of nerds, right?
Well, I mean, what day is it? Is it a work week day? Is it a weekend day?
It
Am I
depends.
off for
Okay.
the summer? Am I on a beach vacation?
So there's a variety of good days.
So
we want
there's a
some more
variety.
context around
Good
the
day is different
assignment.
depending on what I'm supposed to be doing.
Okay, okay, all right. But that really is the process for constructing rubric language, is thinking about what the assignment is and how I'm going to define it. So my examples, I had to do this for myself. This is my good day, bad day. There's some, like there's some productivity in it. There's something about the weather that's in it. And I started out saying sunny, and then I thought, wait a minute, there's that rainy day when I'm just in the mood to clean closets, and that's what you do on a rainy day. So there's something about the weather fitting my mood, something in there. There's something about interactions. If I'm just totally on task all day and get a ton of work done but don't ever talk to a human being, that's not quite on the good day list either. So there are elements that go in there. Now this is not a rubric. This is a checklist because it's either or. It's either a good day or it's a bad day. If I want it to be a rubric, there has
Sort
to
of
be
good
that
day.
middle piece. Technically speaking, and I'm not going to crucify you if you call it checklist or rubric, but by definition, that middle piece, and I would need to put some language in there to describe what's in between a good day and a bad day. Intentionally going fairly quickly through these because you're a quick audience.
Reasonably good.
Or maybe it's not 3 levels, maybe it's 4 levels. Maybe there's something beyond very good that's exceptional. So one of the things I have to think about is, how many levels do I want? How many levels could I have? I could have hundreds of levels if I wanted to. The more levels I have, the more complex my rubric is going to get. So the fewer levels, the more manageable. You have to think about what will work for you. So thinking about reality, and not just a good day, but an assignment you need to grade in your class. What learning do I want students to demonstrate in this assignment? Why are they doing this assignment? It's probably not just to see who's smart and who's not so smart. There's something that they should have learned in my class that I want them to be demonstrating in this assignment. Now, I might talk about that as learning objectives or learning outcomes or student learning outcomes, and I'm going to use those words as if they're all interchangeable. People will argue with me about whether they are, but for this session I'm going to assume those words are interchangeable, and that they mean what learning do I want the students to demonstrate in this assignment? And what quality of student products do I expect? What level am I teaching? So what is going to be good enough on this assignment to earn this grade and demonstrate this level of mastery on these objectives? Before I put you to work, I just want to establish some common terminology just because it's more efficient if we use the same language. I'm going to refer to the criteria of the rubric as the learning objectives that I'm grading. I'm going to refer to levels of performance as those, how many levels of performance, how many layers of how good. So do I want a checklist with only 2 levels of performance? Do I want 3 levels of performance? Do I want to match my rubric to an A, B, C, D, F grading scale and have 5 levels of performance? Your choice. Remembering that more levels produce more complexity. The criteria on a rubric may be bundled all together, or they may be separated out. If the criteria are bundled all together, that's a holistic rubric, and I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. If the criteria are pulled out separately and evaluated separately, that's an analytic rubric. On a holistic rubric, I ask myself, okay, is the assignment more like this level, or more like this level, or more like this level? On an analytic rubric, each criterion is graded separately. So going back to the good day rubric, this is holistic. The criteria are all bundled together. So coming home at the end of the day, thinking about my day, was it more like good? Was it more like sort of good? Or was it more like not? Holistic rubric. Taking the same language but pulling apart the separate criteria, there are elements of weather, accomplishment, balance of social and focus, and quality of interactions. And I can evaluate those separately. This is an analytic rubric. Which is better? Depends on what you like better. Totally up to you, your personality, the nature of the assignment, which works for you. Time for you to work. Think of an assignment for which you want to create a rubric. Specify in your mind or on paper what the learning outcomes are that students are supposed to demonstrate in this assignment. And specify the criteria. What are you going to evaluate? Those should be very tightly connected. The outcomes that you want to measure and what the criteria are should be very tightly connected. They may be identical. And then write a description about what excellent would look like. And then we'll have you share that. Yes?
I have the course design right now such that there is sort of a weekly reflection assignment. How realistic is it to think that I'm going to use the same rubric for all of those, right? It's going to be somewhat content independent.
Yes, your rubric language would be a little more general than what another might be.
Does that make it less effective?
No, no.
I mean, I can see benefits to consistency, but I can also see benefits
Yes.
to being very
Because of the
idea-specific.
50-minute-ness of the session, I decided not to talk about general and task-specific rubrics. That's another split of types of rubrics, whether it's task-specific or general. Now, if I were you, I might start writing one that's task-specific to the first one, to the first reflection, and then step back and generalize that for the rest of them, which would help students get the feeling of what you're looking for in the first one. Okay? I'm going to ask you to spend about the next 10 minutes working in consultation with people sitting next to you if you want. And I will wander around and see if I can listen in or be helpful. Just to play together with a little bit of language, one of the challenges of a rubric is how to not make the description so specific that all a student has to do is follow directions and not think at all, but not so general that it actually means something to students. So some language that I, permission to borrow, understands concepts. That is something that we want our students to do, right? I would like you to think about what the difference is between good, solid, excellent understanding of concepts versus not so good understanding of concepts. Can we come up with some language to describe the difference? Now, I would never use poor. I would come up with some word that isn't quite so demeaning, but for lack of brain right now, I'm going to use poor here. What's the difference?
Well, there are some of the words like that I've used in the past that have seemed to work are like vague.
Vague.
And then under the good section, I would use clear or precise.
Okay. What else? I'd just like to hear shout out some words that you might use to describe the difference between good understanding of concepts and not good enough understanding of concepts.
Comprehensiveness, for good,
Mhm.
spotty or something.
Effective and ineffective.
Effective. And that leads my brain maybe even to effectively applied. Applied, sure that I can spell applied. Ineffective.
About examples?
Maybe even good examples.
Irrelevant example?
Relevant, I like that. Irrelevant or no examples.
I use synthesis sometimes.
Synthesis, meaning taking various pieces of the content and putting them together. Synthesizes content. And maybe then here it's just unrelated ideas.
String of ideas.
Say that louder.
String of ideas.
String of ideas. Yes. Unrelated string of ideas. Here I was going to say, maybe sometimes the word accurate and inaccurate. Would inaccurate would apply to understanding of content.
How about create? Because you could create an application in a new way. So like if they've learned a concept, how will they use it in some other way within their field or?
Yes, yes. And over here, I would tend to put repeats textbook examples, which we can do without understanding anything. And this is actually the way I tackle this, is I just think, what is it I'm going for? And try to get some words out to describe that. And then think about what's the opposite of that. What are those papers that I think, oh, do I have to read this? And a poor paper is so much more work to grade. How are the good papers different than the poor papers? What are the words I can use to describe that? And then, I mean, a lot of this is your own style and how you, I always do the middle last, because the middle is going to be some combination of what's in between. Remember this morning he said, learning is difficult to measure, and if we make learning measurable, we ruin learning. The most valuable learning are the things that are most difficult to grade. And so what the rubric is doing for us is trying to make it a little more gradable, a little more measurable, without compromising worthwhile learning. Understanding concepts, good thing, applying what we're learning, that's worthwhile learning. If your rubric criteria are things like writes 5 pages, you don't need a rubric for that. You can count pages. So I like to reserve rubric construction for the assignments that really are good learning, that are difficult to measure. Yes?
One thing I like rubrics a lot, but one problem I've had, it always seems like when I actually start grading it, like oh, I never even thought of that. You know, that wasn't in my rubric. So, and I want to actually rewrite my rubric every time to kind of.
That's the segue I needed.
Or when the students challenge you.
Yes.
Yeah.
When the students, I will always, if it's a rubric I'm going to share with students, I will go over it in class, we'll talk about it together. As I'm giving the assignment, we also go over the rubric, so I can tell you what I mean. I mean, I've written as best I can what I mean, but I make a copy for everybody, so you can ask questions about what I mean by this. You have an opportunity to ask questions. So if you challenge me later, why didn't you ask a question about that beforehand when we went over the rubric in class? Or come to office hours while you were working on the assignment because you had the rubric while you were developing the assignment. So that's my nasty response to that.
So when you do share it with them, are you sharing it at this level of
No, I've
descriptiveness,
refined it a
or-
little more.
Okay.
I've actually put those things into sentences.
Maybe consolidated some of them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to skip here. I'll come back to these maybe. Pitfalls. Oh, what did you ask?
I ask about, I forget, I think of things after I'm grading the
After grading,
assignment that
yes.
I didn't include in my rubric, and I feel like I need to reflect that in the grade.
The first rubric is always a draft rubric. I use it, but I know it's a draft rubric. And that always happens when I'm using the rubric to grade student work. Like, oh, what I meant when I wrote this was this, but the students thought I meant when I said it was something different. I do what feels right that term in terms of interpreting the rubric fairly across students and say, oh man, I need to revise this rubric for next term. And with me, I have to do that right then before next term comes because I'll have forgotten what changes I needed to make. But that is the best work I do, is revising the rubric for next term right then when I see how it didn't work for these student papers.
But you
Generally-
keep it the same?
I'm sorry?
But you keep it the same during that existing semester?
If I gave it to them and told them this is how I'm using it, and they did the assignment based on the rubric I gave them, and I told them that was how I was going to grade their paper, I feel like I need to follow through on what I said. Now, I might come back if it really is a compromise to their learning and say, I felt like I had to be honest about how I graded this. However, in your learning, you really need to pay attention to this and this and this. So I might come back and address deficiencies in class, but I feel like I would have lied to them otherwise. But absolutely need to revise. Sometimes I find from the rubric that it's the assignment that I need to change. And then change the rubric to go with the new revision of the assignment. So that's the most important part really, is the tweaking and redoing. It takes me about 1.5 years to get a rubric where it's really what I want it to be. And then before too long after that, the world changes and I change the assignment again. So it's an ongoing process, and I don't think I'm an expert at it. Sometimes it's clarifying the descriptors. Sometimes it's changing the weighting. And if it's an analytic rubric, it's really easy to say this criteria counts double the others. And sometimes my rubrics always have some amount of surface feature errors, grammar, usage, punctuation, but that's always about 5% of it, not the whole. So you can write a really, really good paper and be a really poor editor and still get a B in my class. Sometimes it's that changes where. These are questions I like to ask myself at that point where I'm doing the grading and seeing how well the rubric worked that first time. Did better products earn higher ratings? A gentleman in counseling way over here was telling me about a person who turned in a creative, excellent response instead of a traditionally written reflection. And the creative one was clearly better than the traditional ones. So how do you make the rubric so that the actually better papers always earn a better score? It's not necessarily. I think the way you do it is by making sure that your criteria are really what you want your assignment to be about, not the little picky things that are easy to grade. Because if you're going for these higher level things that really are the student learning outcomes that we want our students to be demonstrating, you're more likely to be giving higher grades to work that is better quality. Other questions or concerns? Yes?
One of the issues I have with rubrics, and I've been using them for years, is that the students have come to expect me to hand them a sheet of paper, a checklist, which, we don't do that. But I'm wondering if that is really more appropriate than what it is that we do, because we're very specific in terms of what we're looking for. There's some room for interpretation and analytical work, but it's very specific, because I'm an accountant, so we're looking for very specific answers. But
the division I put in my brain is, would handing you the piece of paper enable you to do well in this assignment without even thinking about it? And if the answer is yes, I'm not going to give you that piece of paper. Because it's the thinking that produces the learning. Now, if there is some way I can take what's on that piece of paper and put it in more general terms that don't talking about clear, precise understanding of concepts doesn't enable you to get to that level without actually clearly understanding the concepts.
well, I usually put it in paragraph fashion.
Yeah.
That's generally how I do it, and say, this is what we're looking for.
Yes.
In addition to the numbers, we're also going to be looking at these kinds of
Yeah,
issues.
that seems appropriate to me. If you want more guidance on what we're looking for in this assignment, come to office hours and we'll talk about it. I'm not going to give you the answer. You're here to think. Jonathan.
Just a little bit off topic though, but I've dipped a toe a couple of times into co-constructed rubrics with students,
Yes.
and I really enjoy that kind of diffusion of power, but it's always been fairly uncomfortable for all of us involved, because we get into some gray areas, and it's uncomfortable. Students, I think in a lot of cases, they just want, just tell me what to do.
Yes.
And so I was curious if Lenore or others in the room had experienced co-constructing rubrics with students, things that they've experienced, kind of things to watch for.
We do a fair amount of that in teacher ed because we need our teachers to be able to
Yeah,
construct
exactly.
rubrics for their classrooms, so it's particularly useful, I think, for us.
Maybe not.
Yeah, I considered doing some of that, but couldn't answer for myself necessarily the fundamental question about does a student start with 0 points and earn 100? Or start with 100 points and lose points? Or some combination of that? And if you're going to co-construct with a student, you got to get on the same page with how you impose that rubric.
That is a really interesting discussion in itself. It's a grading philosophy question. I teach classroom assessment for elementary teachers, so I have that conversation with my students. And it's really interesting because I've never thought about it. I mean, they tend to say, well, I like the professor, so when I walk in they say I have an A, but it's never occurred to me that the only way to go is down. And how do we think about it? When your students walk into your room, do they have a 0 and build? Or do they walk in with an A and just have to maintain? Isn't that interesting? It's a grading philosophy kind of question. So you start with a 0. So you build. Because I'm not grading you on what you brought into the classroom, I'm grading on what you've learned while you're here. But I'm not sure, let's see. Would you have to agree on that to co-construct a rubric? The rubric is like a description of what the product should look like. And if we talk about grading, so what does an A product look like? What does a B product look like? They should look different from each other, shouldn't they? An A product and a B product? So what's the difference? I know none of you do, but I like to refer to the stair method of grading. You toss the papers down the stairs, and how do the ones that land on the top step and get an A look different than the ones that land on the next step and get a B? How do these look different than the ones that land on the next step and get a C? And our students don't always know the answer. So we have some obligation to describe to them in some ways what the difference looks like.
So why do a co-constructed rubric? I mean, I could see benefits in terms of student engagement, but in a non-education class, why do it?
Well, I think in my context, it's a graduate level education course in assessment typically. So what we're doing is kind of unpacking the process of constructing a rubric. It's kind of a 2 birds, 1 stone kind of thing. But beyond that, I think for me, it changes the power relationship between me as professor and them as students, particularly as graduate level students, and I think it speaks to ownership of the assignment, what's valuable in this assignment. I think it transfers a little bit of that, and I like that part of it. The problem is the problem that I have is how much steering to do in that process, and typically how I do that is I launch out and I establish the top categories, the excellent levels of criteria, and even set the criteria themselves, but I am wondering, is that too much steering in that process? And it can be uncomfortable for everybody.
I've done this co-creation in the second course in our news writing program. So it wasn't with the first, but the second one, by then I think they should know what a good story is, or have some ideas. And the value I see in it, in addition to everything you mentioned, is one, it's a review for them, so they remember. And they get to see that a lot of their answers are very similar, so that there in fact is something that is good and something that is not so good. And it really does engage the class too. Then if it's their rubric, then they're going to try to meet their goals that they worked on with me. And at the end, it basically is I'm queen. I mean, so if there's any debate, if it's my decision, I do it. But I listen to them.
It just kind of remove their power of arguing with you at the end if they have to construct the rubric. I think it also plays into building their self-evaluation skill. Because as professionals, we all should become better and better at self-evaluation, and that's something we can help our students gain that they may not be so good at.
Thank you.
Other questions or issues? There are a couple topics I would go back to here. A few minutes. Which way is back? Inter-rater reliability. If you teach the same, if several of you teach the same class and use the same assignments, you can try using the same rubrics, developing them together, talking about what they mean, applying to them. That gives you a way of checking your inter-rater reliability. If you are the only person who teaches your class, that's irrelevant. But it's interesting to me how professional dialogue, talking about what we're looking for in an assignment, improves our understanding of the assignment, improves the grading, it improves my grading of assignments by having more conversation about what I'm looking for in the assignment, what a good assignment looks like. Professional dialogue and improves descriptive language, helps clarify expectations. Absolute versus developmental. This comes up in things like SACS accreditation and places that we're trying to show growth over time. The criteria on a rubric might be tied to the standard in the field. In teacher education, what do we want a first-year teacher to be able to do? Or it might be tied to where you are right now. What do I want a freshman in college to be able to do? Those are different standards. If my purpose is just to do grading from my own class, it is perfectly appropriate to have my criteria be developmental, what I expect you to be able to do right now as freshmen in my class. But if I want to show growth over time for accreditation, those should be absolute standards that are what I want you to be when you're finished. Because I want to show that you grew over the 4 years. If I have a developmental standards on my rubric, grading you as freshmen when you're freshmen, and then when you're seniors, my standards are what you should do as seniors, you're going to look like you didn't grow. Because the standards I was comparing you against were different, and I won't be able to show growth. So that's just a point of awareness for purposes in rubrics, what you are tying to. I think we've talked about this. I was basing the number of handouts I made on my experience here last year, and so I made nowhere near enough. And let me say, if you want the slides or the samples, which really are samples of bad rubrics, you can email me and I will send them to you. But sometimes the categories, the criteria on a rubric are not at all related to the assignment. There is a website called RubyStar for Teachers, numeral, rubystarforteachers.org, and you can find rubrics on nearly any topic. Some of them are a good starting point. Some of them are terrible. This one is on demonstrating an understanding of music in relation to history and culture. Here's what we're grading on. Participate in musical games and dances from a variety of cultures. Listen to a variety of music from various cultures. Demonstrate audience behavior appropriate for music. Do I have to understand anything about music to do any of those things? No. So we want to keep our minds tightly attached to the idea of what learning did we want students to demonstrate in these assignments. I'll tell you, I've seen a lot of rubrics in the P12 arena that are all about participation and behavior and not so much about understanding anything. Here's another one. This one's called Analysis of a Work of Art. Ocean mammal stuffed sculpture. We don't do that in college. We're grading on time and effort and craftsmanship, use of color. Don't need to know anything about an ocean or a mammal. The College of Education and Human Services had a rubric for grading policy. It included competence in knowledge areas. And the description for an A, competence clearly demonstrated in knowledge areas. B, competence adequately described in knowledge areas. C, competence minimally described in knowledge areas. F, competence not described in knowledge areas. What's wrong with this?
What is adequately?
Doesn't really mean anything.
No.
It's language, but how does a student know what's minimal, what's adequate, what's clear, what's adequate? No, it doesn't. It's so vague as to be useless. This final example is a rubric I developed for a freshman level course in educational psychology at my last university. And it was like a cultural autobiography. We were attempting to develop teachers for culturally different schools, for culturally diverse schools. And so the goal of this assignment was to help rural Minnesota kids who thought they didn't have any culture understand what culture was and that they did have a culture, and that ultimately that might have some effect on how their own culture might have some effect on their interactions with people of different cultures in their eventual classroom. And so I brought it because it's an example of an elaborate rubric with points allotted, and if you would like to have a copy of that, you can just pick one up on your way out. Overlapping criteria we haven't talked about. When your rubric is all constructed, looking back and seeing sometimes you've counted the same thing twice. Oh, insightful and thoughtful, are they actually different? Attractive and well edited, maybe they're different, maybe they're the same depending on how you describe it. So that's what I mean by overlapping criteria.
Sorry, could you speak to the last bullet on
Certainly.
that slide about countable?
Countable criteria.
Countable?
That's like 5 pages long.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
With elementary teachers talking, how many spelling errors can a paper have? Yeah. So, if a paper has more than 5 spelling errors, does that knock it from an A to a B? Does it matter how long the paper is? If it's a 1-page paper with 5 spelling errors, is that different from a 25-page paper with 5 spelling errors? Some of the elementary teacher candidates I've worked with want to take 1 point off for each spelling error. Well, you could get a negative score in a paper. You could be better off not ever writing that paper at all if you're a really bad speller. That's what I mean by countable criteria. Those things that are very easy to grade, but don't take very much thought. And many of those things should be included in our grade. Those mechanical things are not unimportant, but we need to think about how that affects the overall weight and what it is we're after in the assignment. That's what I mean about that. Weird. Other questions, comments, issues, concerns? Yes?
Is there any evidence that using rubrics improves student learning?
I do not know any published evidence. That'd be a fun dissertation. My experience is that ultimately it saves time grading. I mean, there's a huge investment of time going into writing a rubric, but when I have the rubric where I want it, it saves time grading. We are out of time. Thank you.